we go.
Perfect. Thank you, David.
You're
So
welcome.
good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Ellsworth Miller Lecture Series. As you know, this evening, Donna Damon is going to be presenting part 2 of her Chebeague education lecture. We appreciate your time that you're joining us this evening and your continued support. Donna, thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And thank you all for your patience of having us try to get through our technical difficulties, but we finally did it and we're ready to go. So some of you, as Mary said, this is the second part of the Chebeague education. It is not the last part because even though it says 1937 to 2007, it really is going to end at about 1956. And then there will be a third installment at a later date, because this is a much more complicated or more detailed discussion. If you really think about how island education has impacted the community and the community has impacted island education. So just to remind, kind of bring people, if you didn't go to the first lecture, that's okay. Just to let you know where we left off. And so we left off in about 1936. And at that time, there were 3 schools on Chebeague. There was the West End School, which still stands. And at that time, it was kids who lived in the West End. That would be anywhere from like the Commons to down behind where the present school is, all the way down to Deer Point. And that was the West End School. The Central School was the Grange Hall and now known as Schoolhouse Seconds. That still stands today as well. And that was built originally as a high school that opened in 1910 when it was originally. Then during the 1930s, they reorganized all the schools and that became the East End Elementary School. So anyone who lived in the area from the Roy Hill Road or a little bit beyond that, all the way to the East End Point would have gone to the Central School at that time if you were in elementary school, which would have been sub-primary through 6th grade. And we didn't have kindergarten on Chebeague, we had sub-primary. And I'm not sure what the distinction is, but that's what they called it. And then the building where I am tonight, that is the museum, was the junior senior high school. And that meant 7 through 12 went to this school at that time. And there was a petition down the middle of the room where we have our exhibits. And so the junior high was on one side and the high school on the other. And that building was built in 1872, 73. And it was built as a one-room schoolhouse for all of the children who lived on the East End of the island, the eastern half of the island. And they were between the ages of 4 and 20. And at the time, the West End School was built in 1896. That too was all of the children from 4 through 20 who lived on the West End. And then in 1902, they started a high school so that they could separate out the older kids so they would be able to get a more focused education. First, it was in a community hall. And then as I said, in 1910, they built the building that later became the Central School as a high school. So that's just a little bit of background about how we got to where we are today. And one more thing, the class of 1936 was the largest graduating class ever on Chebeague. And there were 11 students, and there were more, or 12 students, I'm sorry. And that was 3 more than they had at Greeley Institute that year. At that year, they only had 9 in 1936 at Greeley Institute. So it gives you an idea of how the population was at the time. So and so we're starting after the graduation of 1936. You see a couple of people in the middle of this. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the middle, you see a couple of people in suits. Those were graduates of the class of 36, and it's Lewis Ross and Floyd Hamilton. They came back to play, and you can see Walter Curator over on the left, also in a suit. Not the extreme left, that's Mike Mansfield, but so the others were still in high school. And if you look at the drum, it says Chebeague High School and Troop 31, Boy Scouts of America, Chebeague Island, Maine. And you may remember seeing that in some of our exhibits. That's part of our collection. And so this would have been all of the boys who were in the high school at that time, the high school, and there might have been a couple who were in the junior high at that time as well. And they were Boy Scouts and high school band members. They were the only high school in Maine that had every boy in the school, in the band, and in the Boy Scout troop. So because of that, they got to lead a Boy Scout jamboree down the streets of Augusta, Maine, the capital of Maine. And you can pick them out because of their uniform. They're all dressed in white, and they're being led by this person who is in the very front. I don't know, he was probably some Boy Scout official. But if you look, the person holding the tuba in the front is Stanley Libby, who was the principal of the school, and he brought Boy Scouts to Chebeague, he brought the band to Chebeague, and he was one of those people who, if you asked any of the people who grew up in this generation who an important mentor in their life would be, they would have said Stanley Libby. He had a huge impact, and he actually kept boys in school. At that time, a lot of the boys would drop out after the 10th or 11th grade to go fishing, and he really kept them in school. And so if you want to know how many people they were, you can see it's a long line of Boy Scouts, but this really shows it. The Chebeague band shows up like, a sore thumb here, but, a happy little flower in the midst of this huge jamboree. So that was one of those stories that we heard over and over again. I heard from people like Earl Dowdy, I heard it from Lewis Ross, I heard it from Bill, I heard it from Sanford. And those guys, it was a big deal for them. So when this came to us, these pictures, just recently, someone donated them, and the minute I saw the pictures, I knew exactly what they were. So this is an example of how the community and the school and the Boy Scouts impacted people's lives. So now we're starting with the class of 1937, and there was a class of 5. You can see their names here: Rachel Hamilton, Robert Weldon, Sanford Dowdy, Alvin Newcomb, and Earl Dowdy. Sanford and Bob Weldon and Earl all had families who eventually were living on the island. Robert came back later. Alvin Newcomb had a summer place, so they were still connected. Rachel Hamilton died relatively young. And then these would have been the underclassmen who were in the school at the time in 1937. And we know who all these people are, but we don't have time to really identify everybody, but we can do that at another time if people are interested. So this was the fall of 1941. There was not a care in the world for these kids who were, they were going to be the class of 1942. These were pictures that Martha Hamilton had, that she donated her album. She allowed us to copy it. And she took these as a student, as a member of that class of 1942. And you see the little old schoolhouse, and there's many more pictures than these. And we just picked some out just to kind of give a feel for it. you can see this cupola was no longer on the building at that time. People wondered what happened to it, because if you remember in the earlier pictures, you saw that. But we finally found out, Francis Todd told us that when they were putting a new roof on the school, they took it off, and she lived across the road, and she and her brother Bim went over and they took a wagon and brought it home and made it into a chicken coop. So those are the kinds of stories that we love, and we would not have known if Francis hadn't told that story. So you see there are kids, girls are out playing volleyball. And here are some of the girls, Edna, Katie, Betty, and Audrey and Doreen, and they're just kind of having fun. And here you see Norman Calder with Martha Hamilton, Ruth Hamilton. It was Martha Camlosi then, Ruth Hamilton, Victoria Bowen, and Geraldine Johnson. And as it said, not a care in the world. But what happened? World War II came to Chebeague. And so all of the people that, you know, you saw in those pictures were in that school, not the day, because we know Pearl Harbor was a Sunday, but they were all impacted by that war. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they were impacted, because it had a big impact, unintended consequences really on the history of Chebeague. These were pictures from our 2008, 2009 exhibit on World War II comes to Chebeague. So here's one of Martha's pictures. The Army takes over at noontime Charlotte, that's Charlotte St. Cyr, Chuck, who is a soldier, and Ruth Hamilton. And just think about it. We just looked at these kids who were out there playing volleyball, and now they're kind of cavorting with the Army. And so it's one of those things that all of a sudden things changed dramatically for the people who were in school at the time. As an aside, if you look at this building over behind Charlotte's head, Charlotte has the plaid on, the kind of checked on the left. That was originally the Canterbury Tree House and became the Catholic Church. And that's in that vacant lot now that belongs to the golf course across from the Historical Society. There aren't a lot of pictures of that, so I'm just kind of showing that just for human interest. So here they are, the class of 1942, and they are, you know, they were out in front of the church. The church was where all the graduations took place. It was the community center of the island. And they're all here. You have 4 girls, 4 boys. So it's a class of 8. It was a good sized class, and they're know what's on the horizon because it's in June of 1942. Martha Hamilton was an artist even back in those days. And you can see this picture of Victoria Bowen, Victoria Smith, and Martha made silhouettes of all of the classmates. And we have pictures of most of them holding their silhouette. And so that was kind of fun. When I was a Girl Scout, we made silhouettes too. And someplace in my stuff, I still have mine. My mother had it hung in her house as long as they lived there. So the next section is going to be Chebeaguers who went to war, because we know that all of a sudden things changed on Chebeague and it would never really be the same place again. During World War II, nearly 50 Chebeaguers served in the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Corps, and Merchant Marines. They served in all the fronts, and in land, sea, we had several people who were injured. We had several people who were torpedoed. There was one summer native who actually died in the South Pacific, Dick Seabury, and the clinic at the library is dedicated to him. There was during World War II, the people on Chebeague who were home saved up, they earned enough money, they fundraised, and they bought what became the doctor's house, which is now owned by the inn across from the inn. And that was the home for a doctor until from the end of World War II until 1971. Many summer natives also served. And one of the big changes was very few summer people came to Chebeague during World War II because everyone in the country was being impacted. Oh, wait a second. I lost my thing here. So there were 22 Chebeague High School graduates from 1936 to 1945 who went to war. There were, as I said, there were about 50 total, but many of them were older, and I'm just really focusing on from 1936 on. So I leave out people like my own father. Okay, so we have the class of 42. And out of the class of 1942, we have Donald Ross. I tried as much as I could to get a picture of their high school picture and then put it with their service picture. We weren't necessarily, I didn't luck out 100%, but we were pretty close. And so here you have Donald Ross and Norman Calder. We're in that class of 42, and they immediately signed up and joined the Navy. The class of 43, we have Clifton Thompson. Kenneth Hamilton was 44 and Bud Robinson was 45. And so I'm starting with them because they would have been in the school at the time the war started. So think about it. These guys were in school. Donald and Norman were seniors in high school, and they knew what was coming. They knew that they would be heading to war. And the same was true with Clifton Thompson, Ken Hamilton, and Bud Robinson, and they knew what was coming. So now I'm going to go back, and we're looking back at that class of 1936. We have Lewis Ross and Floyd Hamilton. Class of 37, Sanford Dowdy, Alvin Newcomb, Earl Dowdy, and Robert Weldon. All of the class of 37, every man in that class went to the war. Class of 38, we had all three of the men who were in that class, Lou Monahan, William Hamilton, and Eddie McCormick. They all went to war. Class of 39, we had Dick McCormick, Thornton Ross, Gerald Goodwin. And interesting about Gerald Goodwin, he was out in the Pacific on an aircraft carrier, and he was the radio man. And he happened to be the radio man when George Bush's plane was shot down, and George Bush parachuted down and swam to the aircraft carrier. And it was really interesting to hear Gerald Goodwin tell that story. And if you go to College Station at Texas A&M, you can see the movie. They actually filmed George Bush swimming to the aircraft carrier. Of course, no one knew that he was going to become president of the United States. But that's kind of just a human interest story. Class of 40, Gerald Colbert, Albert Hamilton, Emery Ross. So they had graduated, just a short time before the war started. Neville Goodwin, 41. So you think about all the men who left Chebeague, and what was interesting is how few of them, even though they survived, they did not come back to raise their families on Chebeague, and for a couple of reasons. But which I'll get to in a minute. But right now, talking about the home, or what was going on in the home front, because all these men were gone, the women were really kind of trying to take over. You had people like Leah Weber, who was the air raid warden. And if she saw your windows weren't covered with their blackout curtains, she'd knock on the door and say, "Get your curtains down." And people were, really taking this seriously and really working as hard as they could. They experienced rationing. People were impacted just the way they were anywhere in the country. They held fundraisers for the Red Cross. They collected scrap metal. They wrote to the troops. Marianne Breton donated an scrapbook that Leah Weber kept. And we have made copies of all the letters that were sent back to her. She wrote to so many different sailors and soldiers during the war, and they would write back and send pictures of them in, and some of the pictures that you just saw came from that collection. She also saved the various newsletters that were written, that the island created newsletters that they sent to the troops to let people know where different people were. And when some of these guys would write to Leah, they would say, I know so-and-so's, I heard they're in the Pacific. Do you have any idea where they are? And some of these people actually met up. We have a photograph of, I think it's Gerald Colbeth and Norman Calder, who met up. Ken Hamilton and Norman Calder met up. John and Chesley Calder, brothers, were able to meet up during the war. My father, Ellsworth Miller, and Sanford Doughty passed each other my father was going out of Murmansk, and Sanford was coming in, and they passed each other and had a blinker message. So, people were concerned and wanted to know where their pals were, and some of the people at home were able to provide that information. What's interesting is, if you have never seen a World War II letter, they will say somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Asia or somewhere, they can't really say where they are, where they're writing from. And sometimes there are holes in letters where they cut out different phrases that could have been a clue to somebody. So all these letters were censored before they were sent home. But the community spirit stayed strong on Chebeague, that people were supporting the troops, and they wanted to have this community be a strong place when people came home. They really hoped that everybody would come back and settle and continue to help this community thrive. So going back to the school children, you had children who had siblings in the war. So not only, was the war kind of an amorphous thing for kids, it was very personal for kids. So here's a picture of Ken Hamilton and his brother on the left, Ken Hamilton and his brother Rodney. And you could buy a sailor suit for a kid or an army suit. On the right, we have Dick Calder with the dog, and he's got an army suit on that he's bought. And he had 3 siblings who were in the war. He had his brother Norman was in the Navy, and his brothers John and Chesley were both in the Army in Europe. And so, this was school. You had kids in school, but they had a lot on their minds. They weren't just having the kind of, childhood that their older siblings or their parents had. It was a very different kind of thing. And part of it was they were surrounded by the Army. The Army was here, and they took over the island. They had 4 installations and over 400 troops at the peak. This is very early in the beginning of the war. I'm not sure if this is a picture from the Boxer family or if it's a picture from Martha. Martha had took so many pictures of the Army that they actually called her in. She told me the story. She got called in and they investigated her. Plus she had a name that was a foreign name, Kablosi. They didn't know if she was like a spy or something, but all she was had crushes on soldiers, and she was taking all these pictures all over the place. And her photographs really give an incredible understanding of what it was like to be on Chebeague during World War II and seeing the servicemen. But if you look at this picture, they're in the hall. They were mustered, that's where they were first barracked. And the commander at the time, they had the house where Julie Doughty has. But if you look on the right-hand side, the person closest to us is Herman Boxer, who is Binky Boxer's father. And he came during World War II. He was born in New York City and ended up on Chebeague. And his mother was very concerned when he was stationed here. And she wrote him a letter and she said, I just hope the natives are friendly. And so I don't know whether she thought he was going to someplace like the South Pacific or what, but he always told that story and he would always laugh. You look at the left, you'll see the map of Casco Bay. You see Chebeague on the right, and they have the forbidden area. And I'm not going, this isn't really all about World War II. It's only about how the community was impacted and the kids. But when you look at all those forbidden areas, there are so many stories that people have told and we've recorded about the impact on the water. But one thing that did impact the kids and did impact the community, there were submarine nets between the Great Bar on Chebeague, the Great Sandbar down that goes over to Little John, toward Little John's, and there was a barricade all across it with timbers and like a fence and barbed wire. And then at the end of it, there were where the channel is between Little John's and the buoy. There was a submarine net there. So they had that was one of the installations, was down at that area because they were watching that. There was another at Deer Point, and there was an installation there where they watched the submarine net that was going the other way. And so because Chebeague originally, all the landings to Portland were on the outside of the island because it was part of the Harpswell line. Those were all, Central was taken over by the Army, Weston was discontinued, and they ended up building Chandler's Cove. And they would go, because you could have a ferry going back and forth from Portland, where you see it says boat lane. You could go from Chandler's Cove all the way to Portland without going through those submarine nets. Because before they did that, you could only have one boat a day. Cliff Island, you can see, was outside of it, and they still had issues with transportation. So this is what, it was not uncommon to see the Army walking down the street. This is another one of Martha's pictures. It's taken from her house, from the porch of her house, the Camlosi house, which is on the North Road. You can look over across. And that Aaron's Wharf would be down below here, for those who know where that is. So here was some, we just talked about the encampments. There was the encampment on Deer Point. There was the encampment down at the Great Bar, and there was an encampment at the school. What is now the school? There was no school there. It was a big field. And it was the Army who really built that ball field initially down there. They played ball there. If you, the big installation was at the East End Point. And the house where the Ann Brown's house, East Ledge, was 2 stories. You can see it here. It was moved from the approximate location of where it is now down to the edge of the road. After the war, they cut off the bottom story and made it into a bungalow. But you can, in this picture, you can see the barracks that were built up there. And if Michael Hamilton made this diorama that we had for the 2008-9 World War II exhibit. And so that gives you an idea of all the different buildings that were up there and how it was configured. And you can see there was a gun emplacement. And here are some of the soldiers manning one of those guns. If you look at the photograph at the top right with the dog, again, that's looking down as if you were going down to Easton Landing, heading to Hamilton Beach. So you can orient yourself a little bit. So if you were heading from the East End, from like where the East Ledge is, and you're going toward Hamilton Beach on that road, then you can kind of see where all these things were. So the Army took over the island and the girls. And this is one of the reasons, well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that a lot of the men didn't come back here. They found other lives because some of them, had been, had interests in some of the girls on the island, but some of the girls on the island had interests in the soldiers. So it really did change the demographics. So at least 14 girls who attended the Chebeague Island High School married soldiers. And here's a list of them. Victoria Bowen, Elizabeth Calder, Genevieve Calder, Leona Doughty, Catherine Doughty, Marilyn Doughty, Priscilla Doughty, Beverly Hamilton, Lillian Hutchinson, Catherine Mansfield, Ruth Mansfield, Ethel Newcomb, Geraldine Small, and Charlotte Stilfen. The ones with the asterisks stayed on Chebeague and raised their families here. The others all left the island. And so if you want to have an idea of kind of the impact, if you look at this picture on the left, remember we saw this picture earlier, those are the underclassmen in 1937. The girls who are blacked out have, where they're black and white as opposed to sepia, all of those girls in that picture married soldiers. So that's just a percentage, to give you an idea. And here are some pictures of some of the other girls who married soldiers. Here's a picture here with several island girls surrounded by soldiers. So you can see, and they would go be, I remember Audrey Collins told me that the Army would send a Jeep around and pick the girls up to go up to, they had like a canteen up at near in the East End in that in that barracks area. And so they would go up there for dances, and they would bring they would bring girls down from the mainland too, so that there'd be some, entertainment. So most of the girls moved away to places like Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, but 4 stayed and raised their families here. And so we have Charlotte Stilfen married Scotty St. Cyr. Priscilla Doughty married Red Riddle. Ruth Mansfield married John Slowick. Victoria Bowen married Jasper Smith. And then Leona Doughty married Herman Boxer. And they're the parents of Binky Boxer. And although they didn't settle here and raise their children, they lived in Portland and were here, spent a great amount of time. So there's 5 of these families that have descendants living on Chebeague today. So Islanders supported the war effort on the home front. Now these pictures, because they're kind of blurry, but it's the best that we have. This is the schoolhouse. Remember, this was the central schoolhouse, and at this time, it would have been an elementary school. And on top of it, they built an observation tower, because think about where it's located. You can look right out over Halfway Rock from there. You can see open ocean. And so these pictures this shows it on the school, and this is kind of a blow up. You see a couple of people up there. This next picture shows, look at how they had to get up there. Look at this ladder, this stairway. And here it is on top of the school. So the kids were going to school while people were watching for enemy aircraft. Think about how that impacted those children. And here's a picture of a child. It's Sylvia Ross. She was probably about 12 at the time. And here's her certification that she's an airplane observer. It says she's 5 feet tall and weighs 90 pounds. She's white, fair complected, light. She has light brown hair and blue eyes. And here it's signed by Roy Hill, who was the chief observer. And many, many people, including many other kids, took time. This was manned all of the time. And they were looking out over the bay, looking for enemy aircraft. Now remember, there was Brunswick Naval Air Station at one end of Casco Bay. At the other end, they were building Liberty ships. They built over like 330 or 40 Liberty ships in South Portland. And in between, they had a refueling station for the Navy on Long Island. Casco Bay was very strategic in the war. That's why people were really worried. That's why we had all those soldiers. Long Island had them, Peaks Island had them. And what was interesting is that these people showed up immediately the Army was here in early 1942. The federal government already had a plan. If something happened, how they would man and how they would protect Casco Bay. And I'm sure they had it all over, everywhere. They had some kind of a plan, and they were able to mobilize immediately. So what was happening at the island elementary schools during World War II? We've talked about the high school. We've talked a little bit about what it was like at Central School if you were a student and they were watching for enemy pilots, enemy planes. But one of the big things that happened is bus service became available. First they had Ryan's Taxi and then a school bus during the war. And what this did was, and this is Bill Ross, anybody who knew Bill Ross, he was one of the first, he worked for Frank Rhines, who was his father-in-law. And Frank was also the selectman at the time. But he was one of the first school bus drivers. And this allowed them to reorganize the schools, because people are not going to, might not think about this, but you could grow up at that time. If you lived on the West End, you only went to school with kids from the West End. And so my brother and sister, when they were little, they lived where Claire Ross lived. And so they started at the West End School. Then they moved to my grandmother's behind the Grange Hall, and then they went to the Central School. So they went to school with both schools, and their father came from the West End, so they knew people back and forth, but other people didn't. And some people didn't meet other kids who grew up who were the same age on the island until they went to junior high school. That was the first time they would actually go to school together. And so when they reorganized the school so that the younger kids all went, sub-primary through third grade went to the Central School, and 4 through 6 went to the West End School. This was the first time since 1820 that all of the kids on Chebeague went to school with kids who were the same age. So that meant that everybody who was in the 4th through 6th grade went to the same school. And so in 1820, that's when they created 2 school districts on Chebeague. Before that, they had only 1 school district. And it was centrally located. But as the East End, more people moved to the East End, they needed 2 school districts. So that was huge in bringing the community together. And people, they have all these myths about the East End and the West End. Well, a lot of it was just because Chebeague's a pretty big island. And when you think about how far it is to walk, from one side to the other, you can see why it's like villages kind of are created. So here they are together at last. The West End and Central School picnic in 1942 or 43. So what they did is, this was all of the kids at that time in those grades from sub-primary through 6th grade. And so they were all, they were all in the same place. So here's an example. This is about 1948. Mildred Johnson is the teacher in the middle. And you see all these kids around here. Well, this is Marjorie Monroe in the front. And one time there was a discussion about Mary Ellen Weber Johnson, who is back here, that she was born on Chebeague. And Marjorie said she couldn't have been born on Chebeague because she never came to school until the 4th grade. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, no, she didn't go to school, because Marjorie didn't even realize and think about it at the time that she was going to school on the West End. So they didn't even know each other. So there's a good example right into the 1940s and the early 40s, when they would have been, when they finally consolidated the schools. So people just didn't know the people on the other end. So Chebeague Island High School in the 1949, they started class trips. And so here you have all of these kids here, and they were going to New York and Washington on the bus. And these are the classes of 1953 and 1954. I didn't have a picture of 52. I do know 51 and 52 also went to New York, but I couldn't find a picture of them. But here they are at I think it might be the Stork Club or someplace. But Theron Hamilton was one of the chaperones, and he had only graduated, I think, in 47 or 48. But you see Diane Calder, Dick Calder here. And so this was a pretty big deal. These two people here, we were trying to figure out who they were. And Diane said they were like photo bombers. You know how they have photo bombers now? Well, they did it then. So these two guys here had absolutely nothing to do with Chebeague. And so then this is the class of 1955, and this is Stuart Townsend, who was one of the chaperones. And you can just barely see Hartley Brewer's head here. And they're on one of those Circle Cruise boat trips around. And this is Priscilla Ross, and she's got this camera. And Marjorie Monroe was taking the picture. So they had at least two cameras on here. So that was, what they were trying to do is say, okay, we go to Chebeague Island High School, but we're doing what everybody else does. And graduation was a really big deal on Chebeague. And you saw the pictures of the class of 1942. We could go back and find them from many different eras. But this is the class of 1952. I didn't have we found some graduation pictures, but we didn't have we didn't have the class trip. But it gives you an idea. They're in the church. You can see the pipe organ that used to be there. And they would take like chicken wire and fill it full of boughs. You can see it says 1942. This says launched but not anchored. You can't really see all the words. And then there was this beautiful boat. I think Martha had something to do with this. Jimmy Camosi her brother graduated in this class. And they had 10 people in this class. This was a pretty big class. And these are all the underclassmen. And they're all here. It was like a chorus that they're singing. You can see the girls in the front, you can see the boys behind, but it's the graduates are on the top. And this is the same year, all these girls, but you can see how beautiful their dresses were. And graduation was a big deal. And then there was a big dance at the hall. If you knew Waldo Crafts and Madeline Brewer, here they are just kind of having a dance. And there's Dick Calder off here to the side. And this is the hall. For those of you who weren't here before it was insulated in sheetrock, this is what it looked like. And here's a diploma. This is Minnie Rich, who was Kathy McNeil and Julie Dowdy and Cindy Riddle's mother and Donnie McNeil. And you can see the schoolhouse. This is where the Historical Society is, and they had a picture of the schoolhouse on their diploma. And so my older brother Warren he also had one of these diplomas, and he said he used to show it to people and say, I graduated from the town garage, because we know that this school was eventually turned into a town garage before it became a museum. So here we have, just again, to show you how important graduation was. This is the class of 49. You see everybody's dressed to the T's. They've got their roses. Here's the class of 51, class of 52, 53. And so education was really important in this community. And so during World War II, there were some educational initiatives. People wanted they wanted this community to be strong when the boys came home from the war. So they formed a PTA. And while the PTA was trying to figure out how do we make the school better, they also started talking about, they knew other issues would be raised that didn't have really to do with school, but they had to do with the community. So because of that, they created the Chebeague Island Council. It was an offshoot of the PTA. And I've given part of a talk on organizations, and So the many different organizations would spring off from another organization when a need was discovered. But at that time, none of the three schools had bathrooms or running water. So in the 1940s, these schools still did not have bathrooms or running water. They had outhouses and they carried the water to the school. There was no hot lunch program. They tried to start one and they got shut down because they had no water. So the town or the state shut them down. The island needed a new school to replace the 3 one-room schoolhouses. And because remember, these schools, the building, the Historical Society was built in the 1870s. The West End School was built in the 1890s, and the Central School was built in 1910. Cumberland finally agreed, town meeting agreed that there should be a new school, and the Chebeague Consolidated School opened in the fall of 1953. This is the Chebeague High School in 1951. At the time, they were just getting ready to have, when they were in the planning stages of creating the school. Some of these students would graduate from the new school. Some graduated. A couple of classes still were at the school, but they all knew a new school was on the horizon. 1951, so we had all of those students. And then at the same time, this was the Central School in 1951. Stella Hamilton was the teacher. And so you're looking at, this is Judy St. Cyr right here, Judy Dowdy right here in the front row. So it gives you an idea of the ages of the people in this photograph. And then the West End School at that time was grades 4 through 6. And so here we have these students. And so if you look at all of those, I'm looking for my final topic, and there's 72 kids. Between the picture of the high school, between the 3 schools is 72. There were 36 in the 7 through 12, 23 in sub-primary through 3, and 13 in 4 through 6. So that's a pretty, for an island, 72 kids at that time, that was a lot of kids. So on the horizon, building a brand new school, it was going to have 4 rooms. It was going to be K through 12. It was, things were looking hopeful. In 1950, they hired Stanley Libby, came back to Chebeague. He left and went someplace else to teach in about 1940, 39 or 40. And they had him come back because they knew they were opening a new school. And he had I pushed the wrong button here. They knew that he had the support of the community and that he was probably the leader that they needed to carry it through. This is a picture of his first Boy Scout troop when he came here in about 1930. And there's a picture of him right there in the back. So one of the first things he did is he said, okay, we're going to have a yearbook. And it's interesting, the first page of the 1952 yearbook, it's a full page of his philosophy of education. But just the first paragraph, it is with considerable pleasure that I write this page for the first edition of the Chebeague High School yearbook, the Nor'easter. The idea was born early last fall at a time when I told the pupils the yearbooks were published by other schools. So they'd never had a real yearbook. They all decided that they would like to try to do a book this year. With the arrival of a new duplicator last fall, the idea was made possible. So this was done, anybody who ever taught in a school, about purple paper, and using a duplicating machine and typing on that purple. Duplicating is not necessarily the easiest thing, but the first yearbook was made with a duplicator. This picture, it continued while he was here. And this is the class of 1950. This was the 1955 yearbook. And you've got the yearbook staff. And you've got a picture that looks like it could come out of any yearbook. And you can see now they're using a mimeograph machine. So they've had an upgrade in their technology. And you've got the whole yearbook staff working together to create that yearbook. So things are looking pretty good. We've got a school, a brand new school, and it opens in September of 1953. And this is opening day. And you look at all these kids, and it was hard to count them because some of them were hiding and some of them were not necessarily hiding, but they just blocked between people. But it's 60 plus kids are here at that time. So it was 72 in 1951, and in 1953, we've got about 60 plus. As I said, it's hard because you can see heads, but you can't really see the whole person. So they had a dedication for the new school, and the new school had a petition, a moving curtain that went between the two rooms that were the high school. And so they could teach two classes at once. They had two teachers there. So some kids could be having French and somebody else could be having math or whatever. And so here you see a lot of the community is there to celebrate. Here's Stella Hamilton in the front. Here's Diane Brewer. Here's Jackie Trask, Stanley Libby. This woman with a hat in the middle, kind of to the left, is Mabel Wilson. If you've heard of the Mabel I. Wilson School, she had been very active on the school board. The school board at the time, though, that the school was dedicated is over to the right. And you see Mabel Wilson. The man who's standing up is Alden Schneck. I think his name was Schneck. And Andromaca Camlosi. She was the Chebeague representative. She was Martha Hamilton, Jimmy Camlosi's mother. And then standing up is William Soule, who was the principal, the superintendent, of the district of the Cumberland schools. You see down below, there's Ruth Dyer on the left and Ruth Slowick on the right, and they're in the kitchen, and they actually have a hot lunch program. And because they had created at that time a state-of-the-art public kitchen. In 1953, we look at this is in the subprimary through fourth grade. You see the older kids are sitting at desks. You look at the desks and you say, okay, they brought those from the old schools. And yes, they did. You can see the metal, those had been used for generations on Chebeague, and they went to the new school. And then on the right would be the younger kids. You see the Hamilton twins and Shirley Ross, who would have been subprimary at that time, and they were sitting at a table. And then the kids behind them were the next grade, and they were also at a table. So it's all the same classroom, but if you look to the extreme left, that the table that you see on the picture on the right is over in that corner. And so if you look at Abraham Lincoln, he's in both pictures, and that helps you orient what you're looking at. And this was the same thing. It's the same classroom, but from different perspectives. That's Mrs. Pottle, who was the teacher of the upper grades at the time. And again, you can see they've got those folding chairs. They've got the old desks, and they've got those folding Paris manufacturing chairs that were and also in the hall in the parish house. They were all over New England. They were made in Paris, Maine. And here's the high school. They have brand new desks. Roy Hill personally bought all of the desks and chairs for the high school. He was so proud that and he was the selectman at the time, and he worked really hard to get that high school. And if you look at the floors, you'll see those are asbestos tiles. Later on, they had to have, when they realized asbestos was bad, they had to actually do one of those, I don't know what you actually call it, where they have to go in with hazmat suits and all that to take them out. But so you see that the high school did have them. And again, these are, it's the same classroom, but from a different perspective. And they're not necessarily the same day because the kids are in different places. So Chebeague graduates only one class. So the class of 1954, because they started in the fall of 53, they graduated, and then all of a sudden the population started to drop, and in 1954 Cumberland started to say, well, there's not enough kids and we think we should close the high school. And you'll see there's this newspaper clipping. And so they were, this is in March of 55, they went to town meeting and they said, well, okay, we won't close it for another year. And so Bill Soul and the committee recommended closing the high school because they expected to drop from 12 to 6 pupils the next year. The high school is located in part of this is how they described it. The school cost $50,000 to build in 1953, and it was half of those 2 rooms were half of the building. By eliminating the high school and sending the pupils to Portland High, the town estimates they can save $4,000 annually. That's kind of a summary of this article over here. If you look down below, in the article, the last paragraph, Mrs. Mabel Dowdy, Chebeague PTA Vice President, will lead the island delegation to the mainland tonight, accompanied by Howard Beeler, Herman Pedersen, Mrs. Charles Kuntz, that's Evelyn, and Mrs. Carol Dyer, who was Ruth Dyer, Beeler Dyer, and several others. So they went over to fight for it. They kept the school going for another year. So the class of 55 would not be the last class at Chebeague High School. This is from their yearbook. So this was the class of 1955, which could have been the last class there, but they got a reprieve. But it was short-lived because Betsy Ross was the sole member of the class of 1956. And when they, and the school district would not consider that there were more kids in the pipeline that year of 1955-56, there were 9 in sub-primary, but that didn't matter. And what was interesting and ironic is that Betsy's father, Bill Ross, was a member of the class of 1936, which was Chebeague's largest class, and Betsy was alone as one of the as the lone last graduate of the Chebeague High School. And I took a class with Bill Soul at the University of Southern Maine. He was teaching social studies in the secondary school, and he was an excellent teacher. And it was the only education course I ever took that I actually felt like was beneficial. But so when he found out I came from Chebeague, he said to me, he said, those people probably still hate me there. And I said, I asked him, I said, why? And, we talked about it. And he said, his motivation was that he felt that there was no way that the kids could get the kind of education or the variety of education that they needed, or the various classes that they needed to go forward. That was part of his personal feeling. That didn't make people feel any better. So there were only 4 underclassmen in the end of that year. When Betsy graduated, this was the whole Chebeague Island High School. Think about all those pictures you've seen in these last 2 lectures, from the one in 1936 all the way down through. This is the whole high school. This is freshmen through seniors. You had Mary Weber, who was Mary Gomez. You had Lois Hamilton, who became Lois Kaufmeyer. You had Betsy Ross, Joyce Hamilton, who became Joyce Burns, and Rodney Hamilton. And that was the whole Chebeague High School in 1956. So in September of 1956, Mary Weber, Lois, Joyce, and Rodney Hamilton rode the Casco Bay boat to Portland to attend Portland High School. And that was not an easy thing to do. But, and now for the rest of the story, but not tonight, because there's much more to learn about how education has impacted the people here. You're gonna have to wait for part 3 to learn about how Chebeague kids made out at Portland High School, how they ended up at Greeley, what happened to the Chebeague Junior High, what it was like to cut ice in a wooden boat while on one's way to school, and how a school decision resulted in secession, how Chebeague students ended up at Yarmouth, and more. Here's a teaser. So you see all of these boys throwing snowballs. You see all these children raising their hands to pledge allegiance to the flag. They did that in America till 1942. But this is how Chebeague school children saluted the flag in 1955 until about probably 1957 or 58. And this is a thank you. And I know that Polly Smith is on here, Polly Honeyman, I saw her, and that's Polly in the striped shirt, and that's me smiling, and then my cousin Holly's out in the back, and we played a lot of Pachisi in that school during recesses. And you're going to learn more about what people did at recess also in the next lecture. And you can see David Campbell and Wayne Dyer down below. And if you look, there's Abraham Lincoln again. We saw Abraham Lincoln a long time ago, but he had a presence in that school. And see all these papers? Those were our papers. And you may even see a scan of a paper in the next lecture. And so now if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. And Mary, you're going to have to help me.
Sure. Let's see, if you go to reactions, you will find a place where you can raise your hand, and Donna will know that you, okay, Tom Phipps up there at the top. Tom.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
So this is exciting and very interesting because my grandmother came to Chebeague Island in 1954, and my mother, who was 25 years at that time, started coming summers. Donna, do you have any perspective on how the Chebeague Island kids started to interact with the kids that came, you know, the young adults that came during the summertime?
I do. That's another whole story, but they interacted from the early 1900s. I mean, from the time they came. And some were positive and some were negative.
Yeah, I'll bet. That's just the way it goes, right?
Yep. Yep.
It's very interesting history, Donna. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. And you can lower your hand, Tom.
My reaction has been sufficed, yes.
All right, we've got Sam.
Hey,
Can you
Donna,
speak again?
thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're
This has
welcome.
been great fun. And I remember that shirt. I really liked it. Weren't there 11 of us in subprimary?
I thought there was only 9. I think there's only 9.
I thought that the Riches started with us and
They
then
were,
left.
yeah, Chester did,
Yeah.
but that made 9. There was,
Was it really?
okay.
And
there's
Lawrence?
Okay, there was Lawrence Dyer, Chester Rich, Michael, Wayne, and there were 4 boys. And then there was Holly, Polly, Donna, Sharon, and Valerie.
9.
Huh. I could have sworn we were 11.
Well,
Oh,
if you
well.
think up the other 2, let me know.
Yes. Yes. I'm sure it's in a record somewhere.
All right.
Love the pictures. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Jackie.
Hi, Donna, you've transported me back, to attending the Central School, the West End School, and I think I was in the first group to attend what I call the new school.
Yeah.
But I'm often struck at all three schools how there was no supervision on the playground.
Right,
yeah.
that's one of the things I'm going to talk about at the next one, about recess, because no
Uh-huh.
one would believe, but feel free to tell a story if you want, because
Well, I don't really have any well, actually, seeing Polly made me remember how Lindy and I were on the seesaw at the Central School, and he banged his end down, and I went flying onto the middle metal, pipe thing, and it's a wonder I didn't have a head injury. I had I had kind of a bloody face. And at the West End School, we played out in the woods. We played across the road where there was a cellar hole. And the same was true, at the new school. We played out in the woods and so forth. It was a great time.
thank you, Jackie. I'll tell a quick story. I don't know if Polly was there the day that we did this, but I know that Carol and Beth were there. And I'm pretty sure that I had on nylons, and we were playing this game called the chasing game, where everybody would try to chase you. And we were sure weren't going to get caught. And I think I was in the 8th grade, Beth was in the 7th grade, and Carol was in the 6th grade. And we went so far away that we didn't hear the bell ring to come back in. And
I was thinking the same thing. I was there.
yeah, we were there. I thought you
Yeah.
probably were.
Yeah.
And we waited and waited, and we didn't hear anybody. Finally, we started heading back, and we got back to school. And now today, the fire department would have been out looking for us. It was like probably a half an hour at least after everybody got in. And so we got in there, and Kenneth Hamilton told us that we had to stay in part of our recess, and we were horrified. We just were so insulted that he would make us do that. We're lucky he didn't kill us.
We made it almost to the dump, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.